distance according to Torah was maintained. Now, Torah being our Heavenly Father's instructions, and also being the 5 books written by Moses. Furthermore, during the time the Israelites were moving through the wilderness, they encamped at the end of the day's march in a certain manner, a certain order. If you want to read about this, go to Numbers 35, verses 5 and 6. Numbers 2 states that, okay, if you are very fussed with our Father's word, you can read it with me. The people of Israel were to camp around the tent of meeting, though at a distance, each under his respective standard and by their clans and signs. So the distance is defined in Joshua 3, verse 3 to 4. Let's read that. When you see the ark of the covenant of the Lord your God, with the Levite priests bearing it, so the Levite priests were carrying it, leave your places and follow it, so that you may know the way to go, because you have never walked this path before. But keep a distance of 2,000 cubits, which gives us 3,000 feet or 935 meters between it and yourselves. Do not get nearer to it. Now we know from history and from what we've read in our Father's word that if anybody touched the ark that shouldn't be close to it, they would die. Right, so only the Levites had the authority to carry the ark. The sanctity of the ark was thus therefore maintained. So they had to maintain 3,000 feet a distance between them and the ark, had to be 3,000 feet or 935 meters. So try and see that in your mind, or if you can, just measure it out and see how the distance that was had to be between them and the Holy of Holies. So the sanctity of the ark was thus therefore maintained. There was perfect provision for Yeshua's crucifixion place, according to the Torah requirement, with the Kidron Valley between the Temple Mount and the summit area of the Mount of Olives. To put the nail in the coffin for Gordon's Calvary and the Church of the Holy Sepulchre as the authentic sites at the time of Yeshua, the Sanhedrin, which was the Jewish governing body, used the same rule of thumb for the city of Jerusalem. They took a radius of 2,000 cubits, encircling it as the limits of the encampment with the temple, including the court of the Sanhedrin as the center of it. Anything beyond this radius was outside the camp, that is outside Jerusalem walls. And somewhere beyond this line, our Messiah was executed. So this absolutely prohibits these hoax sites as being the location of the Messiah's crucifixion, because they are well within the 2,000 cubit zone. They are not outside the camp, outside the walls of Jerusalem. That is why the temple had to be built way north of the city of David, meaning north of the Dome of the Rock, and in line with the current eastern gate where the original bridge over the Kidron Valley once stood. Clearly for one reason only, to make provision for this Torah instruction. If we look at the typology of David and Absalom, remember that's a shadow and type of our Messiah. The account of David and his rebellious son, Absalom, who sought to usurp the throne of his father with dire consequences, is a fascinating and yet heartbreaking story. It can be found in 2 Samuel 13 to 19. The whole episode is a typology of Yeshua, the true king of Israel and root of David, who is betrayed and hated by some of his own people who seek to usurp his throne and kingdom. The most interesting thing about this account is the part where David humbly leaves Jerusalem along with those loyal to him rather than fight with his son Absalom. It specifically states that with great sorrow he left Jerusalem, evidently by the eastern gate, and travelled across the Kidron Valley and went up the Mount of Olives to the summit. Let's read this in 2 Samuel 15, verse 23 and 30. Let's read it. And all the land was weeping with a loud voice, and all the people were passing over. And the king was passing over through the torrent Kidron, and all the people passed over toward the way of the wilderness, that is, towards the east in the direction of the Mount of Olives. And David was going up in the ascent of the olives, going up and weeping, and his head was covered. Remember, our Messiah, Jesus Christ, Yahushua HaMashiach, had a crown, and he was going barefooted, and all the people who were with him each had covered his head and had gone up, going up and weeping. The crown on our Messiah's head at that stage was a crown of thorns. So this is a fascinating typology of our Messiah's crucifixion. The writer also mentions the fact that people used to worship Yahweh on the summit of the Mount of Olives, and that we read in 2 Samuel 15, verse 32. And it happened, as David had come to the top, there where he bowed to God, and behold, Hushai, meaning hasting, the Archite came to meet him, his tunic torn, and earth on his head. That we read in 2 Samuel 15, verse 32. Yeshua also went up the Mount of Olives, barefooted, with a crown, with weeping people, to bow before our Creator, to bow before Yahweh. When he died, Yahweh also rented his veil and hasted to obtain a new temple. We're going to be looking at that later on. Where was the veil rented? When I say our Heavenly Father rented his veil, he tore it. That was in the temple, because the curtain was torn from top to bottom. This typology from David is a strong indication that this place was greatly revered in ancient times and was used for the worship of Yahweh via an altar of sacrifice. This could also possibly be the place from where Abram had worshipped on this mount after he was tested with the sacrifice of Isaac, where his obedience was tested. You see, it is no coincidence that the Kidron Valley is mentioned in the Renewed Covenant in relation to the Passover of Yeshua's death. Jesus Christ and his disciples used to spend a lot of time on the Mount of Olives, particularly in the olive grove or garden known as Gethsemane. And this was how Judas knew where to find him when he came to arrest him on that night. And that we read in John 18, verse 2 and 3. But as we learn from the Gospel accounts, the Mount of Olives had an even bigger role to play during the final days of our Messiah's life on earth. And we shall soon see the significance of this mount during those final days of the true King of Israel, the Son of David. So there is every reason to believe that our Messiah fulfilled the type of David by leaving Jerusalem on the east road, crossing the Kidron Valley, and ascending to the Mount of Olives, where he was crucified, sacrificed, near the summit amid much sorrow, because the majority of the people had rejected him. Stay tuned in. We are going to be looking at the clean place and the location of the altar of the red heifer.